So I'm going to talk about Daniel Lind Ramos's exhibition, Ensamblajes. So this is an exhibition that we've been working with Daniel on over the past year. It consists primarily of existing works that Daniel has made in the last few years. So Daniel is an artist who is based in Puerto Rico in a town called Loíza. And Daniel has grown up in the town and spent much of his life in there. It's where he was originally raised as a child, and he's kind of primarily spent much of his life working and based at his studio in Loíza. It's a town on the northeastern coast of Puerto Rico. It was founded in the 16th century by formerly enslaved people who had been brought over during colonial periods. Primarily, a lot of the people had originated from West Africa, so the town has really been kept alive as a hub of West African traditions. The residents are often kind of self-refer as afrodescendientes or afro-descendants. And the town is really kept alive through traditions of storytelling, kind of memories, culture that is passed down. There's a big aspect of kind of festivals or festivities in the town as well. So a lot of Daniel's work really draws on this history and draws on this cultural heritage. He really makes his work based on an originating memory or a feeling or a story that he's been told. But something that I do want to just impress is that for Daniel, it's really important that we don't come in and approach his works as having a fully fixed meaning or a meaning that is fixed to the locality of Puerto Rico, because for him, he's really passionate about his works being relatable to everybody and being about a story of us as a kind of wider global human community. So Daniel makes his sculptures, these large sculptural assemblages, from lots of objects that he either finds washed up on the beaches of Puerto Rico, or he finds them caught in the mangroves. Sometimes they're objects that are gifted by friends or family, so they have a kind of different significance because they've maybe been passed down through generations. But all of the objects, Daniel doesn't see any of them as trash, even though a lot of these objects or items we might pass across in the street and see it as a waste product or something to be discarded. But he sees every item or every piece of material as having a kind of history or a story. And so he'll often gather these materials. Sometimes he keeps them in his studio for a great many years, and then at a certain point he might look at them and they spark a memory, and then he uses that as a building block to kind of build up his sculptures. So the first work in here is a work called El Viejo Griot. The title of the work is kind of a little bit of a wordplay. So El Viejo in Puerto Rico is kind of a figure of an elder or a story, like a kind of somebody who's lived in the community for a long time, but they might not necessarily be an old person. It could be somebody that sells products as a shopkeeper. It could be a craft maker. And then griot. A griot in West African cultural traditions is a kind of storyteller that would have kept oral stories alive alongside poetry and music as well. So within this sculpture, El Viejo Griot is a kind of storyteller that is keeping history alive, and he's bringing it with him. So as you can see, he's kind of traveling along in this boat. The boat Daniel found on the beach, and it had been cut in half to prevent people from using it again, because whoever had owned it didn't want it anymore, but didn't want people to use it as well, so it was cut. And often the boats are kind of used for fishing activities. So there's other materials, kind of the ropes, the burlap sack as well. But essentially El Viejo is kind of traveling in his boat, and all of these sacks behind him have key dates related to Puerto Rico's history. So there's 1511 is, I think, the red sack just on the right. So that was the Taino Rebellion, which was a rebellion by the indigenous population of Puerto Rico against Spanish invasion. 1898 was the US invasion, which was a successful invasion on the US's side. 1797 was the failed British invasion. So a lot of them have to do with the colonial history of Puerto Rico. Obviously, there's quite a lot of dark history within that in terms of kind of the abuse of people, slavery. But equally, there's moments within this history which Daniel sees as being black victories over European domination as well. Puerto Rico kind of establishing itself. But of course, Puerto Rico still sits within a kind of unequal colonial relationship with the United States. This is kind of indicated with this blue piece of tarp just here. So this is a piece of tarp which would have been brought to Puerto Rico by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency of the US. And these became much more prevalent in Puerto Rico following Hurricane Maria. And they were brought over as tarps to be used as temporary shelter or to kind of like patch in holes in roofs. But the kind of response to Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico was quite limited, because there had been Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Harvey in the US in the same year. And a lot of the materials and kind of like aid work and support workers had been allocated to those. And that really left Puerto Rico receiving like the limited or like the end of the run of resources. The US had had a kind of mess up with their tarp provider too. But El Viejo as a character is a character that reappears in Puerto Rico's annual festivities, the Fiestas del Santiago Apostle, or the Festival of St. James the Apostle. And as a child, Daniel actually used to dress up as this character. So he kind of has had such a long connection, and for him, he sees it as being possible that any member of the community could be El Viejo. But the costume for El Viejo is traditionally used cardboard to make a very simple mask. You would then buy a kind of like suit jacket it's important that it would be secondhand as well, or pre-owned, and a kind of pre-owned suit. And so the cardboard is referenced within this kind of like face area of El Viejo as well. So for Daniel, when he's working with materials like this cardboard box, it's very much a box as he found it. He's very keen on not manipulating the materials too much so that they still kind of retain a quality that is immediately recognizable or familiar to us. Also alongside it is a work called Ambulancia. And Daniel was quite keen with these two works because in a way they're both kind of vehicles. And we have the boat as a kind of storyteller, and then the ambulance is here as a kind of helper. But this work Daniel produced after the peak of the COVID-19 pandemics. And he was really drawing on when COVID was kind of taking off and quickly spreading. Daniel was in New York at the time. So for him, there was a large amount of anxiety because he was kind of separated from his home, his family, his community. Both of his daughters work in the medical industry as well, so there was a lot of concern for them. But this sculpture is really drawing on his memories of that time and the kind of collective anxiety, the grief as well. He has like recollected that a lot of the time he was seeing people wearing like plastic bags over their head, or they were kind of dressed fully in plastic as a form of protection. So he's also associating the idea of the ambulance as being a symbol of help, but also a symbol of anxiety as well. And the kind of top of this sculpture is composed of the like siren light and then the tannoy as well. But in the sculpture, what's noticeable is that they're very quiet, and it kind of is implying this sense of like loss or grief. There's the bed, the empty mattress base as well, the springs. A lot of hospitals were struggling for bed capacity during the pandemics. So he's kind of looking at that kind of lack of space, but also the emptiness of the mattress springs is a kind of emptiness that's left after somebody passes away. And at the back of the sculpture, you can kind of see a pair of boots, which are just pushing forward, but really the burden is heavy. And it's a burden that we've kind of all collectively borne as well, and we still carry with us too. The front of the sculpture, this kind of mask element is referencing like oxygen masks or like extra like breathing support as well. So it's a very emotionally, like there's a lot of emotion embedded in the sculpture really. And what's interesting about these two works is that for Daniel, color is really important too. So with El Viejo, you have these kind of warmer colors, brighter kind of primary colors, which are more associated with like the festivities, like celebration, gathering, being together. And then the colors on Ambulancia, these blues and purples, they're often associated with more like maybe colors of like illness or sickness. And in Puerto Rico, the color purple especially is a color that is commonly seen at funerals. So Daniel is kind of bringing that kind of cultural significance of the color into the work as well. So before I talk about the sculptures in this space, I'll just touch on the video work as well. So Daniel hasn't made a huge amount of video work. It's something that he's only started doing in recent years. And I think this video work has a lot of connections to El Viejo Griot. This was a work that was commissioned by the Contemporary Museum in Puerto Rico. And it was originally prompted as being a kind of like gathering or a kind of activity. So in the video work, Daniel has kind of set up somewhat of a narrative with some of the characters from the festivities. So it starts off with El Vigilante, which is a kind of trickster character coming in and doing a cleansing ritual on the beach. And then it kind of shifts towards El Viejo coming in and standing up on a podium and narrating some of the history and some of the dates which are on the sacks in the sculpture. And similarly, some of the public who were just kind of alongside the beach or walking along, they started getting involved as well. So they became part of the story and they started carrying the sacks of history and placing it in front of El Viejo. So we were really keen to include this work in the exhibition just because it adds some extra context, but it also the sounds of the waves. It's really nice to have that alongside El Viejo as the boat is kind of coming in onto the shore as well. But within this space, the sculptures in this area, so these are two sculptures within Daniel's Mangrove series of works, which are a newer series of works he's been producing kind of since 2022, 23. And recently in a lot of Daniel's work, he's been really interested in kind of eco-critical themes, thinking about the ecosystem in Puerto Rico, but also globally and that kind of shared connection between them. So in Puerto Rico, there are a lot of mangroves. One of the mangroves, which is near to Daniel's home, is amongst academics kind of recognized as being like an extremely significant mangrove on the island. It's very important as a kind of coastal defense because it limits coastal erosion by breaking up the waves as they hit the shore, but it also has its own ecological niche with wildlife and plant life as well. But of course, Puerto Rico is an island in the Caribbean, and it's really seen as a holiday destination as well. And for development, people are seeing it as having a lot of potential. So along the coastline, there's a lot of push for development or a push for building holiday resorts or like beach resorts. So for Daniel, he's really keen on exploring what that means for the community and how that impacts the relationship between the community and the mangroves and that historical connection as well. So both of these two works here are really looking at the history of female labor that has been associated with the mangroves and also like activism as well. So Centinela de la Luna Negra, or Sentinel of the Black Moon, which is this sculpture here, is really an ode to like activist efforts at protecting the mangroves. But as a sculpture or as a figure, this work is kind of a guardian that is watching out for decisions taken during the darkness, maybe decisions that you might imagine being taken in boardrooms or underhand decisions by property developers that will have a significant negative impact on the community. The mangroves historically have been a resource for materials, but also sustenance. So this figure is keeping an eye on the community and watching out for those decisions. Some of the objects that have been used within the sculpture, there is some wood from the mangrove. There's also like tools kind of associated with possibly building, like the shovel and the axe, also possibly for harvesting and agriculture. This green kayak is one half of a green kayak, which was gifted to Daniel by a group of activists. In particular, one woman who's a friend of Daniel's is really leading the charge on looking at more, maybe you could describe it as like ecotourism, like ways of viewing the mangroves or interacting with them that doesn't cause a huge negative impact. And one such activity is renting kayaks and then using that to tour the mangroves. The glass here is kind of representing the water of the mangrove as well. And then equally, Centinelas de la Luna Nueva, this is a kind of group sculpture. And the title kind of translates to Sentinels of the New Moon. The new moon and the black moon were both times when traditionally the mangroves would be interacted with, whether for replanting or harvesting. But within this sculpture, this kind of ring of figures are really representing the community. And in the center, you can't see it from all angles, but there's a kind of little lid which has this green and red, and then there's a tiny piece of cut mangrove. And this piece of cut mangrove represents like a mangrove that has been freshly cut, but it's something that can regrow over time. And so what's happening in this sculpture is this group of figures from the community. They're encircling it, they're protecting it, and while they watch over it regrowing, over time, eventually the mangrove will regrow, eventually it'll kind of spread its branches, it'll help reduce coastal erosion, it'll provide more sustenance, materials, but it'll also then protect them in return. So really these works are interested in this kind of mutual relationship that we can have with nature. But of course, the impact that Daniel looks at is specific on a local scale, but really, as with most environmental concerns, there's a massive global impact as well. So the mangroves are being affected by more increased weather, like Puerto Rico has been seeing an increase in hurricanes. It's kind of damaging them. So they need our protection as much as we need their protection. So it's kind of about communities coming together and looking at the future as well. And again, with this work, a lot of the materials used to make it have been materials that have been borrowed from kind of agriculture. This is a kind of traditional broom from Puerto Rico. There's also a tool here that would be used to split coconuts as well. But when you kind of travel around the sculpture, what you see is that the tools are being held as tools, but possibly they're also being held in a defensive sense as well. The sculpture on the far side has the blue bin lid, which also kind of acts as a shield. So they're kind of becoming guardian warriors in a sense for the mangroves. And of course, they're also set with this kind of mixing of the water and the shore as well, and some water in the middle. And then also just to touch a little bit on the display, with all of the display, but especially in this gallery, these kind of pedestals, Daniel was really interested in imagining them as the pockets of mangrove as well. So often the mangrove trees are growing in clusters, and where they're clustered, there will be thicker sediment or thicker kind of base or soil beneath them. And then there will be channels of water that kind of navigate around and through them. So this floor space where we walk is really representing those channels. So these sculptures are kind of taking us on a journey through the mangroves. And I'll just talk briefly about the new commission as well. But that is essentially Daniel sees as a counterpart to Luna Negra over on the far side. It's called the Green Guardian, and while the Luna Negra is kind of seen more as the feminine persona, the Green Guardian is taking on more of a masculine persona. And the face of the Green Guardian is composed of an old fan cover, which Daniel found caught in the branches of the mangroves after Hurricane Maria. And this fan cover he's had in his studio for many, many years. It's over 7 years now. But yeah, so the fan kind of becomes this large eye, this eye that is watching. And then equally, the kayak that is used in Luna Negra is now the other half is used in the Green Guardian. But in the Green Guardian, it's used in an upright position, because for Daniel, that is signifying alertness, or it's signifying the act of watching, rather than horizontal, which implies more of an act of rest. So yeah, the Green Guardian is this kind of guardian that is watching over both the mangroves and the communities, but with its large eye, it's kind of staying ever vigilant. And it's kind of signifying the mangrove's role as a protector and defender of the coastline and the communities that interact and rely upon it as well.